So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to begin by learning the syntax of the jest library, and then later on, we're going to add on the syntax of the React testing library. These are two separate technologies that we're going to combine together in this section, but we're going to begin with the basics of jest. Remember, jest can be used separately from React testing library. And so what we're going to do to familiarize ourselves with the basics is write some basic tests for super simple operations. We're talking things like addition and subtraction. The goal here is not really to test our code just yet, but to get comfortable with the functions that are available within jest. So here I am back in our user form project, and I've expanded the src directory. And as you can see, there's already a test file in here called app.test.js. As a reminder, jest test files are going to end with the extension .test.js or .spec.js. And as you might have guessed, you're typically going to have a test file for every single component. And that test file name is simply going to be the component's name. So here we have our app.js file for the app component. So app.test.js is intended to be the test file for that component. Right? So if we have component a.js, we'll similarly have a component a.test.js file. Now, where you place that complementary test file is kind of up to the developers and the team. In this paradigm, you can see that the Create React team placed the test file in the exact same directory as the actual component file itself. That's not always like that. Sometimes developers create a separate test directory, for example, at the top level of the code base, and in the test directory is where they create all the .test.js files. There's no single right answer. It kind of depends on how you like to organize your code, whether you want to have your real implementation code live side by side with your test code. It's really a topic that's not worth debating right now, but what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to open up app.test.js and we're going to clear all the content in it right now, because this is actually a sample test using React testing library, which we haven't gotten to yet. And we're going to kind of build up this test from scratch. So in here, I'm going to remove the existing code. And even though this test is intended to be a test file for the app component, we're welcome to write whatever jest tests and assertions we want in here. That naming paradigm is a best practice. We're just going to break it for a couple lessons here because we need some test file, and this one should do for the basics that we want to learn. All right, as long as your file has a .test.js extension, it should be fine. Jest will recognize it and say, okay, this is a test file. I'm going to run the logic inside of it. Okay, so in this lesson, I want to introduce you to two functions available in Jest, and they're called describe and it, like IT. Now, the important thing to know is Jest will automatically load these functions when we run Jest from our terminal or from our command line. So we don't need to import anything at the top of the file. We can simply use these functions in line. They're going to appear to be these global functions that are just magically available, but don't worry, Jest will provide them whenever the test actually runs. So the first function I want to introduce is describe. I'm just going to write it in line and immediately invoke it. And describe, just like the name says, is simply describing what we are testing. So you can think of this as declaring like a chapter heading for our test, some kind of organizational name for what we're about to test. Describe is actually functional, but I like to add it to every test to make sure we sort of have this documentation for what exactly is being tested in this file. So for example, if we are in app.test.js and we are testing the app component, what we can provide here is a string like app or app component, right? Or app component functionality. The point here is that the first argument to describe is a string representing what it is that we are testing, right? So describing what is under test. So in this case, we're not actually going to be testing the app component just yet. So what I'm just going to write here is mathematical operations, because that's what we're going to be testing in a lesson or two from now. So the first argument to describe is a string describing what we are testing. And the second argument is going to be an inline arrow function like so. So I'm going to add that arrow function, and then I'm going to break it up right here. And typically, what we're going to do is nest the tests within this describe block, or more specifically, within this function block belonging to the function that we pass as the second argument to describe. The idea here is within a single test file, we can actually have multiple describe blocks. So we can have, for example, a test for some component here, and maybe some other component. I'm not necessarily saying that this is best practice because we're probably testing too much, but the key idea is that the describe function describes what it is that we're testing as the first string, and then the corresponding arrow function that we pass in is where we actually write the logic for that combination of tests, for that sequence of tests. All these tests here are going to be related to mathematical operations. All these tests that we write in here are going to be related to some component, and all the tests that we write here are going to be related to some other component. And when we run these tests in the terminal, what Jest is going to do is actually output these strings so we can see kind of the parent category or header of what is being tested and see all the tests that fall underneath that category. So once again, describe is optional. It's purely for organization and categorization and making things easy for you as a developer to understand what is being tested. The string that you put in there is entirely up to you. All right, so that is the first function that I want to introduce to you. And the second function that I want to introduce to you in this lesson is called it, it. So I'm going to write it in line and invoke it immediately. So we're going to place our it function calls within our describe function calls. And we actually use the it function to write the test itself, right? So it is required, describe is not. One important thing worth knowing is that there is an alias in the Jest library for it. An alias is just an alternate name for the exact same thing. So you can either use it or a function called test by itself. It and test are the exact same function under the hood. They are two names for the same thing, and it is up to you as a developer to decide which one you prefer to do. Each one is exactly the same. They work the exact same way. I prefer to use it, and the reason I prefer to use it, and also the reason why the function is named the way it is because the intent here is that you will make your test read very much like a sentence. So the first argument that we pass to the it function is a string that describes what specific thing we are testing. And the way I like to think about it is reading it left to right as a sentence. So it is supposed to do what, right? So maybe if our describe was a component, our it statement could be something like it renders a button for the user to click, right? So we're describing, ideally in a non-implementation specific manner, what it is that we're testing, what is supposed to happen. It renders a button, it navigates the user, it makes a request to fetch data, etc. We're describing what's supposed to happen, what we are validating in the test that we're about to write. So since we're testing mathematical operations here, the first test that we're going to write is just going to be adding two numbers. So I'm going to say it adds numbers. Again, it doesn't really matter. We're just providing a string for this specific test. So just like describe, the second function that it accepts is going to be an arrow function. So in line within my invocation here, I'm going to add an arrow function and once again, break it up like so. Okay, and it's in here that we're going to write our assertions or our validations. It's in here that we're going to follow that arrange, act, assert pattern to write some kind of validations. We're going to do that in the very next lesson, but I just want to show you, just like we had multiple describes a few minutes ago in the file, we can have multiple it function calls within the same describe function. So for example, here I can do another test like it, and then my string here will be subtracts numbers. And then once again for it, I'm going to provide an arrow function in line as the second argument. So the way this works is describe describes what we're testing. Everything in this function is going to be that those things being tested, kind of like a higher level category. And then for the it function calls, those are the specific tests. So this is going to be a test for adding numbers, and we're going to place that test logic in this arrow function. And this is going to be a test for subtracting numbers, and we're going to place the test logic in this arrow function. And both of these it function calls fall under a parent category of what we're testing called mathematical operations. So describe and it both have the same signature. They're both going to accept a string as the first argument and a arrow function as the second argument. I think it can even be a regular vanilla JavaScript function with the function keyword, but 95% of the time you're going to see a plain arrow function here. All right, so we're kind of describing something and then we're providing a function where we're going to perform that logic. All right, so I'm going to save this. Prettier is probably going to collapse a couple of these things, but that's kind of the basic start. So in the very next lesson, we're going to go inside these functions right here, and we're going to write our basic first assertions, and that's really all there is to know with the jest library. That's all you need to know. So we've covered already like 50% of the needed material. All that's left to do in the next lesson is show you how to write an actual assertion, a validation, basically a confirmation that JavaScript can run something and produce the expected result that we tell it to expect. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.